Today we're looking at Unit 4, Notes number 4. This is our last set of notes for Unit 4. Today we'll be looking at Roaring Twenties culture. So we're looking at the start of mass media, the rise of popular culture, kind of what people were interested in during the 1920s. So the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s changed America forever. No other decade before it had brought about more radical change to American society and culture. So we start to see pop culture existing, mass media, and so it's kind of the start of the modern age of American history. First, let's look at radio and mass media. So the idea of mass media is news that all people are getting, or information that everyone's getting. So now there is the radio, so people can all listen to, the same radio program information, magazines, newspapers. So just the idea of mass media really picks up during this time period. The airwaves and mass print. The radio becomes one of the most powerful means of communication. Tuning into the airwaves gave Americans a shared national experience. So if you look at this picture up here at the top, people are sitting around a radio. And so the radio in the 1920s is like what the TV was during, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where, people sit around in their living room, in this case, listening, not just to music, but to radio programs. The radio brought the world directly into American homes, so whether people are listening to news, listening to music, hearing comedy programs, sporting events. So it was the first time ever we could listen to news live. The 1920s also saw massive growth in newsprint and magazine journalism. Time magazine and Reader's Digest were very popular during the 1920s. So basically every home had a radio. So again, people are getting the same information at the same time, hearing the same thing, and that's the idea of mass media, mass communication. So people tuned in at home to listen to music, they had dance parties. These are old-fashioned radios. And a lot of the original sitcoms began as radio dramas or radio programs. So people would listen. So instead of watching a show, people would listen to actors act things out. They would have sound effects to hear it. And so that's what people did. You tune in every week at 6 p.m. on Wednesday and listen to this program or that program. And later on, once television came about, a lot of those radio programs turned into television shows. So radio in the 1920s, Americans brought the radio into their homes and tuned in for news, music, performances, and sports. Next, let's look at heroes and fads. An era of heroes and fads. So Americans spent billions of dollars on leisure activities, including fads. So Americans during the 1920s had more free time, allowing them to indulge themselves, discover hobbies, watch sporting events. They went to outdoor sporting events like baseball, and many of these athletes became heroes. Babe Ruth was the biggest star of all. Jack Dempsey was a championship boxer, and so people idolized these athletes for their accomplishments. Many of them set new records, tested human limits. Babe Ruth had a home run record for a very, very long time. Another hero during this time period was Charles Lindbergh, and we'll talk more about him in the next slide. So some other fads during the time period was Egyptian history. So you see these Egyptian items. So King Tut's tomb was discovered during the 1920s. So there was a new fascination with ancient Egyptian culture and history. So Charles Lindbergh became the first pilot to fly solo across the Atlantic when he flew his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, nonstop from New York to Paris. So flew from New York across the Atlantic by himself in this tiny little plane. And so people weren't even sure he was going to make it. So, they're waiting for him to arrive. So it was a huge milestone, a marker, an achievement. He became hugely popular. He became known as Lucky Lindy. People were just excited that an American had made this accomplishment, and so he was very well known during the 1920s and the 1930s. Next up, entertainment and literature. Movies, music, and the arts. Movies were silent and in black and white. They became an American pastime on the silver screen. So the early celebrities were silent movie stars. So often their acting, because there was no sound, there was no dialogue, they would have to be much more dramatic and act things out. So you could tell that they were happy, they were sad. Oftentimes, if you look at the picture here, while the movie was playing, you would have an orchestra or a soundtrack to accompany it to play, music to allude to what's happening on screen. Stars like Charlie Chaplin, Rudolph Valentino became American legends. It wasn't until 1927 that the first movie with sound was played. Painter Georgia O'Keeffe and other artists embodied the Art Deco style. American writers known as the Lost Generation became known as the Lost Generation. In their works, these authors criticize American society's greed and inhumanity. They're referred to as the Lost Generation because many of them had fought in World War I. They became kind of disillusioned with life, began to question things, consumerism, materialism, and that's what was seen as big themes in their writing. So we have some of the Lost Generation authors: F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, The Old Man and the Sea. So very, very well-known figures. You have Charlie Chaplin, Rudolph Valentino, popular celebrities, actors, and George Gershwin, a band leader. So jazz music, the motion pictures, and American literature became national treasures in the 1920s, and these are just some of the icons that people admired during this decade. As American culture adapted, African American culture was coming of age. After decades of oppression, Black culture was going mainstream. Seated in a background of slavery and prejudice, Black music and art gave African Americans an identity. So this leads to the Harlem Renaissance. So the origins of the rebirth. The rebirth of Black culture begins with the Great Migration. So we had talked about that, I believe, in the last unit, where during World War I, lots of African Americans left the South, moved to the North. They wanted to leave the discrimination they felt in the South. They were looking for new jobs, looking to make a better life for themselves, new opportunities. By 1920, 5 million Blacks, 40% of Blacks in America, had lived in cities. So they're leaving the rural life, the agricultural farming life. They moved for cheap factory jobs to escape Jim Crow South. Still, racial tensions rose in cities between whites and blacks. Harlem, New York became a central capital for Northern Blacks. With a huge African American population, Harlem was the heart of the rebirth. So it was an African American community where people could test out their art forms, feel comfortable within their community in terms of their expression through their various art forms, whether it was literature, painting, sculpture, music. So the struggle for equality. By 1920, two distinctly different groups had formed in civil rights. And then this will also play a part in the more modern civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So we had the NAACP, and it sought equality among races through legislation and militancy. W.E.B. Du Bois preached open protest of discrimination. So they were hoping through changing laws to make it so that all races could be equal, have the same opportunities, trying to prevent and stop discrimination, create more education opportunities for African Americans. There was also the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This was founded by Marcus Garvey. and it focused on a separate black society. So they were separatists. So instead of the integrated approach that the NAACP was taking, where blacks and whites should integrate and work in society together, Marcus Garvey and the UNIA felt that blacks would never truly be accepted, so they needed to separate themselves from society. He started the Back to Africa movement, called for blacks to unify away from whites, go back to their home country. So this never really took off. Marcus Garvey, who was Jamaican, ended up being charged with mail fraud and was deported back to Jamaica. But these two standpoints, in terms of integration versus separatists, definitely still happen when we talk about the modern day civil rights movement and kind of the viewpoints that people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X take. So African American art. The Harlem Renaissance blossomed in music and literature. Black writers, artists, and musicians celebrated black culture in their works. So it was a way for them to express what their lives were like, the struggles they faced, discrimination they felt, to be completely honest with that, to write books, novels, short stories, poems, to express those feelings, and to have people read them, and also people read them and like them and appreciate them and commend them for their honesty. So black writers and artists and musicians celebrated black culture in their work. Writers such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were tops. Hughes' poems spoke about black struggles. Hurston wrote emotional books about blacks overcoming Jim Crow with strength. And something that also set their writing apart is that they often featured black main characters. You get the black perspective, you understand what they're going through, so it's a way for them to demonstrate what their lives are like too, not just within their community, but to the mainstream. So we have some other figures within the Harlem Renaissance, some music figures. The Cotton Club was very famous for jazz, so you'd often have people like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith performing. It was a whole musical revolution. Many whites would flock to these black nightclubs to hear this new music sensation, jazz. And jazz became an American musical art form, kind of basically just coming from cities like Harlem. And that is the end of our notes today. So you want to make sure you go through and review key terms, fill out your key term list. We will be having our key term quiz later this week. Make sure you've updated your summaries as well.